The weapons in KCD2, they are not perfectly balanced. There are definitely better and worse weapon types, and I think you're going to have a better gameplay experience if you choose a certain few. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the different weapon types. I'm going to break them into categories, and I'm going to rank them from the best weapons in the game to the worst. And I'm definitely going to spend some time talking about what's better in the early game and then what weapons transition well into the later aspects of the game. I consider if you're on the first map before the wedding, that kind of be the early game. And then when you get to the big city, Kudenberg, that to be the later game. Now, we do have three categories of weapons in the game with swords, heavy weapons, and polearms, but it's a little bit more diverse than that because some of the weapon types, they have different options. Like heavy weapons have both hammers and axes, and they play a little bit different. So we're going to break it down into hammers, axes, swords, short swords, and polearms. So let's start with the strongest weapon type in the game, and that is the short sword. And especially in the early game, sword and shield especially is extremely strong because the shield will give you those extra stats on your defense, and it also makes it easier to perfect parry. But besides those advantages, on the first map, it's a lot easier to find short swords that have good stats comparative to long swords. Actually, the broadsword that you get when you rescue Mutt has better stats than the extreme majority of long swords that you're going to find in the early game of KCD2. Now, past just damage numbers, the short sword is so good for a variety of reasons, and of course, as a sword, it has access to the Master Strike, which is probably the most OP technique in the game, since it's basically just a free hit that your opponent can't counter. And on the first map, especially, the enemies, the bandits, are going to let you pretty much Master Strike them at will. It's very easy to do, and you kind of consider the first map kind of like a training ground for your combat. When you get to the second map in Kudenberg, the bandits and the opponents you run into are going to be much better in combat in that they will actually Master Strike you back if you make a mistake, and they're also going to use charged attacks into feints so that you can't just Master Strike them at will. So Master Strike does lose a little bit of its OPness late in the game, but it's still extremely strong, and I wish every weapon had access to it. Now, on top of that, the short swords are the fastest weapons in the game, and once you get to the end game with this thing and you have it at rank 30 with a high agility and a high strength, not only does it do pretty good damage, but this thing is so damn fast that it makes combinations super overpowered, because against a mob that's not too great, I can literally just combination through their perfect blocks or their counters, and I'm going to hit them anyway. You can get away. I feel like with the short sword is the easiest weapon to use because you can get away at the end game with just spamming overheads for good damage or stabs, and you're going to get past pretty much any enemy's guards. It's just super, super strong. And even at the end game, the stats on the short swords and the long swords won't be too different, that I think going with the short sword is the better option. And if you do make it to the end game or the mid game, I think it is super OP if you just get rid of the shield. And if you take the perks that give you different combat statistic boost, if you run a short sword with no shield, it becomes completely broken OP, and you do as much or more damage than a longsword. It is so good, and you don't sacrifice any of the speed, and by that end game point, you should be so good at timing perfect parries that you don't need the advantages of a shield. Now, second on my list is the weapon that it feels like the game was designed for, and that is the longsword, which is actually my personal favorite to use. And I would accept arguments that at the end game the longsword might be better than the short swords, and I'll get into why. But I still feel like it's number two in my book because it doesn't have quite the speed that the short sword does, and it has only a little bit more damage. But the longsword is so good because, again, like the short sword, you have access to every technique in the game, including the Master Strike, and you also get all four directional attacks, which means you can be really diverse in how you choose to attack your enemies. The longsword has solid speed and decent damage, and traditionally, you would expect a sword not to be that good against armored opponents, but when you are max level in the majority of the combat skills, you're still two-shotting people with the swords. So There's no real reason to run anything else. It gives you access to the full combat system, and you're able to do really good damage with it. I feel like the longsword also probably has the best combinations in the game, and once you start using them, combinations are really strong at the later levels, and that pommel strike can often just one-shot an enemy, so it's super, super good. Now, on the first map, the longsword stats, they just don't, I feel like, equal in general the short swords that you're going to find. There's no real reason to run one. But in the later game, there is a reason why I could probably accept people saying that they prefer the longsword, and that is because the bonus damage in those stabs, longswords tend to have better stab damage than the short swords, and they get a bonus against armor if you're stabbing. And when you're doing natural combinations or focusing on stabs against armored enemies, they go down really, really quick. It is a great weapon, and I think it's almost like a 1A, 1B situation. I think you're going to have the most fun playing this game if you choose one of the swords. It feels like the combat system was designed based around the swords, and the other weapons were kind of added in. But that being said, I know there is a special place in a lot of people's hearts for crushing someone's head with a hammer or a mace. So let's talk about my third weapons, which is the blunt weapons, the hammers, the maces, the ones that do really, really good damage against armored opponents. So the hammers are supposed to be the weapons that you pull out against opponents who are in full plate, but now they work well against every enemy in the game. If you're hitting someone who's unarmored with a hammer, it's going to hurt a lot. All the weapons work pretty well against unarmored opponents in the game. But the bonus here to using the war hammers or the maces is that when you level them up fully, they can one or two tap fully plated enemies. So they're really good for that. But at the same time, there are some drawbacks to using one of the mace type weapons. First one being you only have access to 3 directional attacks, slashes, and overheads, and you don't have access to the Master Strike. So when you don't have access to Master Strikes, it takes a little bit away from the combat system, and it's also gonna make it a little bit harder to land guaranteed offense. This is a weapon that's gonna rely a lot on using feints for its offense, which early in the game, when you don't have much level to your weapon and you don't have the perk and agility that makes you a better feinter, it's going to be a lot harder for you to land strikes. And it's going to make group fights more challenging too, because you can't get those quick guaranteed kills with like a master strike into a combination where you take an enemy off the table immediately. It's a much slower pace to your fights when you're using a warhammer or a weapon that's not a sword, where you really have to focus on your positioning and your tactics in combat. So this is a weapon I think that opens up a little bit in the later game once your character starts getting OP and you don't have to rely on those master strikes too much anymore, and you can focus on combinations and using your feints and your charged attacks, and they do a ton of damage. I do think the devs missed a big opportunity here by not adding master strikes, because there could be some sick executions where you bust someone's head open with a hammer. Now, my 4th ranked weapon is the axes, and the axes fall in kind of a weird position where they're supposed to be in between a sword and a hammer. Swords are probably supposed to be the best weapons against opponents that are not heavily armored. Hammers are supposed to be the best against heavily armored opponents, and the axe is supposed to kind of fall somewhere in between those. But the thing here is I don't really feel like there's a need for this kind of niche of weapons, because the swords can just kill every opponent in the game pretty easily, and the hammers can too. So other than just liking the look of an axe, I don't feel like there's a reason to use them. And the axes, definitely, they can land more bleeds if you take the perks for them. But a lot of times, especially at the end game, when your opponent gets stronger, you're going to be killing the people in a few shots anyway, so you don't really need that damage over time. I guess the bleeds do have an advantage in that they'll kind of take an opponent out of the fight. So early game, I think there is an aspect of the axes having some good things to them, but I don't really see any reason to ever run an axe. Now, I do want to say the way that the axe and the hammer is the most OP is if you want to just kind of ignore the combat system and just spam clinches against people. You can clinch with these things all day if you have the wrestler perk and some decent strength, and it is super broken, super OP, and complete cheese, and I don't think you're going to have any fun playing like that, but it is a way. And now, last on my list, we have the polearms. And if you're someone who finished the initial tutorial of the game, somehow stumbled on a polearm, and are like, "Hey, I'm gonna be a pole main," I feel horrible for you because the polearms in the early game they are just terrible, terrible to fight with. It's gonna take a good 20 levels of leveling them for them to start open up. And here's why. The polearm is in this weird position where it's supposed to be a long weapon that does a lot of damage, that you can abuse its reach. But the problem with that is that as a player character, you can't abuse the reach with it because your opponents will get suction cupped to you no matter what you do. If you throw a strike at someone and dodge back well out of the range of their axe or short sword, they're like, "Hey, I think I could just throw another attack at this guy." No, that's not going to work because the enemy will lurch 7 feet to you to land their locked on strike. I don't like that about the combat system, so there's no real kind of abusive range when you're the player character. Now, in group fights, it's kind of the opposite. Some of the NPCs can be a pain in the ass to deal with when they have halberds because they can kind of keep range. And if you're in a group fight, you can kind of pick at people from range too. But I don't really see any reason to use the weapon over the others. And to make it worse, for some reason, the developers decided that these weapons were going to break like just nonstop. I went to a bandit camp at 100% health today, fought two bandits, and left the fight with my weapon on 30% durability. These things absolutely get destroyed until you take the perks that make them last longer, and they still get destroyed a bit after that. It's just a pain in the ass, and another step that I don't really see any reason that you'd want to make people take. Now, the polearm doesn't have many combinations, only has four. The stomach slicer is the best one. It looks pretty sick. I'm very disappointed that it doesn't have an overhead attack. I feel like that's another missed opportunity where you could take a weapon that could do devastating damage, a long two-handed weapon, you swing it over your head. That could have been something special about the weapon that made it really have its own place in the game. But right now, it's just a slow weapon that does good but not wonderful damage, and it doesn't master strike. It also breaks in 2 seconds. There is no reason to run this weapon other than that you just want to run a polearm. If you do run polearm, again, feints are going to be your friends. It's going to take a little bit until you can start landing combinations. You got to get to rank 20 or so. The weapon will open up when you get to max level and be a lot more fun to use. All right, guys, so that is our ranking of what weapons you should be using. As we said, this is probably a sword game designed for swords. If you're still having trouble with the combat here, though, I am going to have some tutorials pop up somewhere, somehow, here now. You can click my beginner tutorials. They'll teach you everything about the combat system. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I recommend that you guys use the swords from here on out. All right, champ out.